Last week, Novara Media's Rivka Brown published an exclusive. You might remember it. Using letters leaked to her from within the Foreign Office, Rivka reported on how Foreign Office bosses had advised civil servants concerned about the UK's tacit support for Israel's genocide in Gaza that they should see a therapist or talk to HR or resign over their worries about one of the worst crimes we've ever seen committed in our lifetimes. At the time, we covered Rivka's report on this show too, but now something a little curious has happened.
More than 300 members of the UK Foreign Office staff who signed a letter raising their concerns about UK policy towards Israel over its conduct in Gaza have been told by civil service leaders that if they profoundly disagreed with the government, then they could resign. The letter was sent to the Foreign Secretary David Lammy last month. It questioned the UK's continued arms sales amid what the civil servants called Israel's stark disregard for international law. The Foreign Office said in a statement the government had rigorously applied international law in relation to Gaza.
Do you notice anything missing there? You got it. Not a single mention of the fact that Novara Media broke that story almost a full week ago. Now, it's generally good journalistic practice to at least do your fellow reporters the courtesy of mentioning when they've broken a story first. But the BBC didn't bother, and neither did The Guardian, at least not at first, with their diplomatic editor, Patrick Wintour, running the story without a mention of us either. The Guardian, to their credit, has now updated that story to acknowledge Rivka's work. The Telegraph, though, has run it uncredited too, as has The Times, as well as The Independent. They've got in on the action as well. It's pretty outrageous, I think. Earlier today, I was joined by Rivka Brown, and I began by asking her to tell me how she'd come to discover her work had been cribbed.
So this morning I woke up to a story on the BBC and then on the Today programme, which reiterated my story, but without crediting Novara Media. So I was obviously delighted to see that the story had got pick up, and it's since been picked up by all sorts of national outlets, the Telegraph, the Independent and elsewhere. The Guardian also, but very few have credited Novara Media, and the BBC has refused to amend its story.
Now, look, they say imitation is the greatest form of flattery. So I guess, nicking your story must mean that they think you're golden. But why does this matter?
Well, I think it matters because it's about acknowledging the legitimacy of Novara as a media outlet. Now, the BBC, or at least its journalist Tom Bateman, claims that he had the same documents that I had and therefore was working on the story independently to me and didn't copy his story from mine. Now, even if that's true, it's significant that a tiny outlet like Novara Media that employs some 20, 30 people could get its story out faster and scoop the national broadcaster, the BBC. And it's significant that the BBC chooses to omit that fact despite publishing their story 5 days later. Now, that omission gave rise to massive confusion. The BBC, not mentioning Novara Media, made many people, including The Guardian's Patrick Wintour, think that the BBC had broken the story. Now, who got there first might not seem like a big deal for many people, but having an exclusive story and scooping other journalists is part of the profession of journalism, being the person to get the story out there first. And I think it's really symbolic, this reluctance on the part of the BBC to acknowledge that we were the ones that broke the story, because it's a refusal on the part of the liberal media establishment to acknowledge the work that Novara does. And I think it's the same reluctance that makes the liberal political establishment undermine and ignore the contributions of the left politically, which is that to legitimate the left media or left politics would be to acknowledge its own cowardice. Now, you'll know very well that for the past 20 months, Novara has been at the forefront of covering the genocide in Gaza and calling it what it is. Now, only 20 months down the line are we seeing other outlets and mainstream outlets like the BBC doing much of the coverage that Novara has been doing since day one at much greater reputational cost. And so I think this story is a symptom of that. 20 months ago, we would have never seen the BBC rummaging around inside the Foreign Office, trying to find kind of dissenting civil servants on Gaza. And only now are they doing that. And only now are they realizing, is the country realizing that outlets like Novara Media had it right all along. So I think that there is a kind of embarrassment on the part of the BBC to only be not just getting stories like this, but getting the whole story of the Gaza genocide and its ramifications so late in the day.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. The BBC really not wanting to put people's eyes on this scrappy journalistic organization whose coverage of this genocide completely puts them to shame. Rivka, people in the audience may not know quite how long it takes to put together an exclusive like yours. What was the process? How long did it take? And how did you do it?
So it was tremendously difficult, so it's a combination of making, clear to people that you're approachable for tips and waiting for them to come to you, and also seeking out through personal and professional networks, through tools as basic as LinkedIn to ones more complicated, people who might give you stories. And for months now, I've been cultivating sources within the Foreign Office, as I'm sure the BBC has, as I'm sure the Guardian has, people who might be willing to speak about this stuff, which, when it comes to civil servants, takes a long time because trust in journalists among civil servants is very low and fear of professional repercussions is high. And obviously, there's kind of a huge job to be done fact-checking, ensuring that you can have multiple people verify your story, legal checks to ensure nobody sues you. The list goes on. I think people, including the BBC and Guardian, tend to think that outlets like Novara Media are just talking heads. They're a group of influencers, but actually we employ lots of people behind the camera, lawyers, editors, fact checkers. And those are all the resources that we've poured into work like this. And I think that, it's actually hugely impressive that we managed to beat the Guardian and the BBC, mostly the BBC, to this story. And I think, the BBC should want to amplify the good work being done, by independent, much smaller and less well-resourced media outlets. But obviously, for politically motivated reasons, they don't want to do that. The thing is, though, we don't really need the acknowledgement and, legitimacy conferred upon us by the kind of establishment media. Ultimately, we just need our supporters to like us. And that's something that actually sets us apart massively from outlets like, The Guardian or The Telegraph, who rely on people kind of having giving them some sort of legitimacy, on a national level, being given awards and so on. And whilst Novara is starting to break into those arenas, and, we were nominated recently for Amnesty Media Awards, I've judged work at international journalism festivals by the BBC, by Channel 4 and so on. We don't need them to like us. We just need our supporters to like us. And in that way, we're actually much less vulnerable to the kind of vicissitudes of journalistic reputation than those other outlets.
Do you think any of those outlets are going to correct their copy to credit us and you properly?
So The Guardian, to its credit, has actually already done that. It took them a couple of hours, but they corrected it. So thank you to Patrick Wintour. Tom Bateman at the BBC, however, has doubled down on his insistence that the BBC shouldn't give us credit, despite the massive confusion that his article and accompanying news bulletins has caused. So we've submitted a formal complaint to the BBC, which will probably take a good few weeks to come back with anything, but we'll keep you posted.
That was the truly, truly excellent Rivka Brown talking to me earlier today. And I think what this episode shows really is that Novara Media is setting the agenda. We're breaking the stories that now the mainstream are kind of copying. We're smashing into the mainstream, whether they like it or not. And your support allows us to do the kind of journalism the mainstream either can't do or can't even credit us with. So we obviously want to continue growing as an alternative to the mainstream, to legacy media, and your support is the only reason we can do that. So please go to novaramedia.com/support and sign up to keep us going, keep us growing, keep Rivka breaking those great stories, or as John Moore put it in the chat, fund Novara Media so Rivka can keep driving the BBC nuts. Helena, what do you make of this story?
I think it's funny that Rivka said, well, we were all journalists, we're not just influencers. I basically just am an influencer, which is quite funny, but I think it's really important when you look at the work people like Novara do, is that when you look at the establishment media, there is a gigantic ideological bias to the centre and to the right, especially pro-capitalist, right? It's all very manufacturing consent. You can read Parenti and Chomsky and understand the material basis as to why stories that are kind of unique to a leftist perspective would never actually get broken or even pursued by the mainstream media, because that's not the narrative or the consent that they're trying to manufacture. So having people outside of that level of being beholden to donors, of being beholden to billionaires, of being beholden to shareholders, allows there to be a breadth of ideological positions within those organizations to be able to find the stories that would be missed elsewhere. What frustrates me a lot about British journalism as well, which makes it so much worse than so much all of the other countries in terms of journalism, is it's the ultimate closed shop because of the British class system as well. In that you look at the number of people who are journalists in this country, right? Like 52% of them went to private school, and a lot of them will go to the same private schools, and they'll go to Oxford and they'll go to Cambridge. So these are people who know each other. When they leave one organisation, they just pop up with the next one, like, Allegra Stratton, is that the one who was at the BBC, at ITV, and then at the BBC, and then was Boris Johnson's press secretary? And you're just like, how is this kind of endless kind of merry-go-round of people moving around our political and media establishment allowed to kind of continue with nobody scrutinizing it? Like, who watches the Watchmen? And that's something that you get from having an iconoclastic media that presents a narrative outside of the mainstream media perspective, again, which is a material basis for that. And there's also a cultural basis as to why this has to exist too. And why it's very important that we stay, that's why it's so important that we continue to no longer be beholden to corporations and big donors, because we have people at home supporting us, and that's who we're only ever going to be beholden to.